Welcome, everyone. So I want to kick things off today with a bit of a thought experiment. It might sound a little out there at first, but believe me, it gets right to the heart of some really big questions about intelligence. Just imagine for a second that your mind, everything that makes you you, your thoughts, your awareness, could just exist as a program, like software. Okay, if that's possible, could that program run on, well, any machine? A supercomputer, sure, seems plausible. A biological brain, obviously. But here's the kicker. What about, say, a rock? Just a plain old rock sitting there. Could your mind theoretically run on that? Now that sounds absurd, right? But this question, this little thought puzzle, that actually leads us directly into this huge philosophical and scientific challenge. And it's one that's really shaking up how we think about intelligence, both ours and the artificial kinds we're trying to build.
That's a perfect starting point. Because, as our sources really dig into, a lot of modern AI development kind of runs on this hidden assumption. It's almost baked in without us noticing. And it's exactly that kind of thinking. We're calling it computational dualism. It sort of echoes René Descartes, his whole mind-body split thing from centuries ago. We tend to think of intelligence as this abstract thing, like an algorithm, a disembodied mind that could just float free from any physical body or hardware. But the big question we're tackling today, based on this material, is what if that basic assumption is just wrong, fundamentally flawed? Is intelligence really something that can be copied and pasted onto any substrate, like silicon or, a rock?
It really does get under your skin, doesn't it? Yeah. So our goal today is to really challenge that dualistic view. We're going to pull together some really fascinating ideas from philosophy, from biology, computer science. We'll explore this idea that intelligence isn't some abstract code floating around. Instead, it's an emergent property, something that arises from systems that are embodied, physically present, and deeply coupled with their environment. We'll be drawing on frameworks like Enactivist cognition and Pancomputationalism, big words, but we'll break them down. Basically, our mission here is to figure out why moving past this old Cartesian idea is so vital. Not just for building AI that's truly smart and grounded, but maybe even safer AI too. And maybe just as importantly, what does this all mean for how we understand our own minds?
And get ready for some surprises. We're going to talk about how seemingly simple organisms, things with tiny brains, or no brains at all, sometimes show these incredibly complex cognitive abilities. Makes you rethink what brain even means. We'll unpack these things called Markov blankets and see what they have to do with the basic idea of having a self. And we'll even look at current AI, large language models like GPT. Are they showing glimmers of self-reflection, acting like these weird artificial mirrors reflecting our own minds back at us? We'll examine what all this might mean for the future of artificial general intelligence, AGI, and honestly, how it might shift our perspective on ourselves and maybe even reality. It's a real journey into how intelligence is woven into the world.
Okay, so let's really dig into this computational dualism idea first. It's like finding this ghost we didn't realize was haunting the machine all along. Historically, as the sources lay out, Descartes proposed this non-physical mind interacting with the physical body. Maybe through the pineal gland, he thought. A clear split. Mind versus matter. And what the sources suggest is that in AI, we've basically just updated this. We've swapped out the pineal gland for something like the Turing machine concept. It's a go-between, mediating between the software, the AI's supposed mind, and the hardware, the physical machine. Think about it like this, maybe. You've got a brilliant chef, right? That's the software, the AI program. They have this incredibly complex recipe, the algorithm. Then there's the kitchen, that's the hardware. Ovens, stoves, mixers, all the physical stuff needed to execute the recipe. We often just assume the chef's skill, the recipe itself, is totally separate from the actual kitchen tools. We think that recipe, the software, could be made perfectly in any kitchen, anywhere, as long as the instructions are followed to the letter. And that belief that intelligence is substrate neutral, that the same mind could run on silicon just as well as neurons, if the code's right. That's computational dualism in a nutshell. But is that really how it works?
That analogy nails it. And it highlights what Michael T. Bennett, in a pretty recent paper from 2024, calls the interpreter problem. This is really key. An algorithm, just the code on its own, it doesn't do anything. It's just symbols. It needs a physical machine and an environment to actually run it to interpret those instructions. Bennett's point is, if we imagine some super intelligent software just existing abstractly, we ignore the crucial question. Who or what is doing the interpreting? It's like a musical score. It's meaningless until an instrument plays it and someone hears it, right? And AI's code is that score it needs, the whole system, the physical computer and its environment, to give it meaning. So Bennett argues, pure software can't be intelligent by itself. Intelligence only shows up when the software's actions have actual consequences, when they're given semantic force by an interpreter. And in AI, that interpreter isn't just the CPU, it's the sensors, the robot arms, the screen displaying text, and crucially, the world that reacts to what the AI does. Computational dualism sees AI as this disembodied policy acting through an interpreter. But Bennett says, no, cognition is a process happening within the whole system, including the environment. When we say a chess program knows checkmate, we really mean the entire system program, computer board, player reacting, behaves reliably in that situation. The intelligence isn't in the code alone, it's relational. It's in the interaction, the dynamic dance.
Wow, okay. That's a pretty fundamental shift, because it makes you seriously question those purely computational ways of defining intelligence, like Kolmogorov complexity, or that theoretical AIXI model. These models try to define intelligence with abstract math, right? Like the shortest possible description of something, or maximizing rewards in some formal game. But as Bennett points out, they mostly ignore the physical reality needed for intelligence to actually, exist and do things in the real world. They assume this clean, abstract link between agent and environment. Take AIXI. It's this mathematical ideal of infinite intelligence needing infinite computing power. Sounds impressive, but it's pure theory. The source material points out that AIXI basically assumes some kind of magic interpreter and infinite resources totally removed from physical constraints. Bennett sees it as a prime example of computational dualism. Intelligence is just software, detached from any body or limits, and his conclusion is pretty stark. This kind of theoretical intelligence need not have any bearing on reality at all. It's a disembodied policy, disconnected from the real world, embodied struggle that actual thinking involves. So if abstract definitions don't cut it, where is intelligence?
Exactly, that's the million-dollar question. And it pushes us towards seeing intelligence as a relational property. It's not inside a system in isolation. It emerges from the interaction between a system and its environment. The philosopher Hilary Putnam made a really famous argument here, the triviality argument. He basically said that almost any computational description you apply to a system is kind of, in the eye of the beholder to some extent. His thought experiment was that if you get clever enough with mapping states, you could interpret even a simple rock as performing any finite computation. Like a rock warming up in the sun, you could, with enough mental gymnastics, map its temperature changes onto the logic of a NOT gate. Now, that's absurd, obviously, and that's Putnam's point. It shows intelligence isn't some built-in property. The meaning, the intelligence, emerges from how a system interacts within a specific context, often involving an observer or a purpose. So we shouldn't just focus on the program's internal structure, its form. We need to look at its dynamic function, what it actually does, how it makes sense of and responds to its world. A program sitting on a hard drive by itself is no more intelligent than Putnam's rock. It only becomes part of an intelligent process when it's running, interacting, embedded in this network of interpretation involving hardware, designers, users, the environment, the whole shebang.
Okay, so if we buy into this relational view, how do we even measure intelligence anymore? We need ways to capture that dynamic function, not just the static code. Those old complexity measures, they focus on the algorithms form, right? But what we really care about is adaptability. How well does a system handle the crazy variety of stuff the real world throws at it? This is where Bennett introduces this really interesting idea, weakness. Now, weakness here doesn't mean flimsy or easily broken. It's actually the opposite. It means having weak constraints on behavior. A highly intelligent system, in this view, is one that doesn't have too many built-in assumptions about how it should achieve its goals. This lack of rigid constraints gives it flexibility, lets it reconfigure itself and find new solutions when faced with new problems. Think about a human baby. They start out as these incredibly general learners with very few hardwired assumptions. That's what allows them to adapt so broadly and learn practically anything. It's about having degrees of freedom, the ability to explore possibilities, not just finding the single most elegant or concise algorithm. Bennett actually did research showing that models selected for this kind of weakness, maximizing flexibility, generalize much better to new situations than models chosen just for simplicity. Strongly suggests intelligence is more about adaptive range and freedom than just compact description. It's about being capable in a broad sense, not just efficient in a narrow one.
Right, and building right on that intelligence as relational, as dynamic, we get to enactivism. This is a really powerful framework. brought forward by Francisco Varela, Evan Thompson, and Eleanor Rochbeck in '91 in their book, The Embodied Mind. Their core idea was pretty radical. Cognition isn't just computation happening in the head, it's a form of embodied action. We don't just passively receive data, organisms actively enact or bring forth their world through constant interaction. It's about how knowing and meaning are created by doing. Okay, so there are a few key pillars to this. First, autonomy and operational closure. Enactivists argue that cognitive systems are fundamentally autonomous. They actively maintain their own identity, separate from the environment. Think about Varela and Maturana's concept of autopoiesis, or self-production. A living cell is constantly rebuilding itself, defining its own boundary. This creates a kind of operational closure. It doesn't mean closed to energy, but that the system's organization maintains itself, making it an agent acting on its own behalf, not just a machine reacting passively. Second, embodied sense-making. This is huge. Cognition is sense-making. Meaning isn't out there waiting to be found. It emerges from interaction and the organism's needs. Like, take a bacterium swimming towards sugar. It doesn't just register sucrose molecules present. It senses sugar as food, as something good, something relevant to its survival. That meaning comes from its embodied need. The slogan here is powerful. All cognition is embodied and embedded. Our specific body, our sensors, our muscles, and the environment with its possibilities, what J.J. Gibson called affordances, these together make up our cognitive process. A chair affords sitting to us because of our bodies, but not to an ant. The world we experience is shaped by what our bodies can do. And third, structural coupling. This is about the continuous back and forth between the agent and its environment. The agent acts, perturbing the environment. The environment responds, perturbing the agent via its senses. Over time, this creates this kind of dance where the agent's internal structure, its brain maps, its habits, becomes attuned to the environment's patterns. And sometimes the agent even changes the environment to suit itself, like beavers building dams. That's niche construction. So each agent, with its unique body, basically brings forth its own subjective world, its Engelwelt. What a bat sees with sonar is radically different from what we see with light, even in the same cave. Perception isn't about building an objective snapshot, it's about skillful participation in a world that's relevant to you.
That's fascinating. It makes you completely rethink basic things, like just see, Arriga and Noe back in 2001, they talked about how perception itself is really about mastering how sensory input changes when you move. They call these sensory motor contingencies. Think about it. You know, a coffee mug has a back, even if you can only see the front right now. You don't have a little picture of the back stored away. What you know is the practical skill. You know how the visual input would change if you moved your head or walked around it. It's not abstract knowledge, it's know-how, like riding a bike. As Noe put it, perception is not something that happens to us. It is something we do. Seeing is a way of acting. This just completely merges perception and action. It's one continuous loop, which fits perfectly with enactivism. It's not about building static models. It's about skillful interaction.
And for AI, the implications are huge. It suggests that for AI to be genuinely intelligent, maybe it needs a body. It needs to learn through real physical interaction, not just crunching abstract symbols. This was actually a big criticism of early AI, what they call Joe AI, good old-fashioned AI. Thinkers like Hubert Dreyfus pointed out way back that real intelligence involves this intuitive, skillful coping with the world, something symbol crunching AI totally lacked. But now we're seeing a big comeback for embodied AI in robotics. Rodney Brooks's work in the 80s and 90s with his subsumption architecture robots was revolutionary. These things were often simple, like insect robots, but they showed really complex, adaptive behaviors navigating messy rooms, avoiding obstacles without building detailed internal maps of the world. Brooks famously said, "The world is its own best model." Instead of complex internal representations, the robots relied on constant sensing and immediate reaction. Very enactivist. The takeaway for AI seems clear. Maybe real intelligence doesn't come from a disembodied program after all, but from systems that learn by doing, by leveraging the physics and feedback of the actual world.
It sounds almost philosophical, but there's actually a pretty rigorous mathematical way to think about this in AI now, thanks to Carl Friston and active inference. This framework lines up beautifully with enactivism. It basically says an agent maintains a predictive model of its own sensoric motor loops, and it constantly acts to minimize the errors in its predictions. Friston calls this minimizing free energy. So instead of just planning and then acting, an active inference agent is always adjusting. If its predictions don't match what it senses, it has two options. Either update its internal beliefs, its model of the world, or act on the world to make the prediction come true. This inherently blurs the line between perception and action. If there's a mismatch, you can either change your mind, perception, or change the world, action. It's an active agent in motion. Perception becomes active, and action serves perception. It's about keeping the world aligned with expectations. Active inference, then, gives us a formal way to talk about structural coupling and even autopoiesis. The agent and environment are locked in this continuous dance, this closed loop of internal states, predictions, and actions, all aimed at maintaining self-consistency, keeping the agent stable in a changing world.
And one really interesting concept that helps bridge statistics and biology here is the Markov blanket. Sounds technical, but the idea is pretty intuitive. It's basically a statistical boundary separating a system's internal states from external states. The boundary itself consists of the system's sensory states, inputs, and active states, outputs. Think of your skin and muscles. Skin takes info and sensory, muscles act out, active. Everything inside is internal, everything outside is external. The Markov blanket ensures the outside world can only affect your insides via your senses, and your insides can only affect the outside via your actions. This creates circular causality. Outside affects senses, senses affect internal state affects actions affect outside, and round it goes. This boundary is what allows an autonomous system to exist as distinct, constantly monitoring inputs and adjusting outputs to stay within its viable range. For a cell, the membrane is a literal Markov blanket. For a robot, its sensors and motors define it. And this connects nicely to biosemiotics, the study of signs and meaning in living systems. Work by people like Fields and Levin shows how biosemiotics complements enactivism. It argues that meaning isn't just a human thing, it's inherent to life. Even simple cells interpret signals, chemicals, light not as raw data, but as something significant for their survival. Meaning, in this view, isn't some abstract property of language, it's what happens whenever a system responds to a sign in service of its own goals. Think about bacterial quorum sensing. A specific chemical signal doesn't just mean molecule X present. To the bacteria, it means lots of us are here, time to change behavior, because it triggers an embodied, goal-directed response. The meaning is created by that response. Okay, so we've established the mind isn't neatly separable from the body or the world. Now let's flip the coin and look at the idea that computation itself isn't separate from physics. This leads us into Pancomputationalism. This is the provocative idea, explored by thinkers like David Chalmers and Luciano Floridi, that every physical process at some fundamental level is computation. Now, this doesn't mean your garden gnome is secretly running Linux, it's more abstract. It means that any change of state in a physical system can be interpreted as information processing. If you accept that, it really blurs, maybe even dissolves, the classic hardware-software distinction. If the universe itself is computational, then what we call hardware, the physical stuff, is intrinsically performing computations just by following the laws of physics. Software, then, becomes just a particular way we describe those physical state transitions. Big implication. That old idea of computation being totally substrate neutral, that the same algorithm runs identically on gears, silicone, or neurons, might be true at a very abstract level, but it misses something deep. The substrate itself contributes. There's no computation without physics, and the specific physics matters.
Yeah, that's a huge point. Pancomputationalism actually helps us see why computational dualism is tricky. Descartes split mind and matter. Computational dualism splits software and hardware. But pancomputationalism says, hold on, it's all just physics. It's matter and energy interacting according to rules. And those interactions, those changes of state, can be viewed as information processing. So it's the monist view one kind of stuff rather than dualist. That apparent split between software and hardware. It's just an abstraction level we find useful. When a program runs, it's not two things interacting. It's one physical process, electrons moving, maybe that we describe in different ways, logic gates, high-level code, whatever. The software doesn't exist independently of those physical changes that implement it. And this directly challenges that idea of intelligence being fully substrate neutral, because the physical medium matters. It is the computation, in a way.
But naturally, this raises a big counter-argument, the triviality problem. If everything computes, doesn't the word computation become meaningless? If we say a river computes erosion, or the solar system computes planetary orbits, haven't we just diluted the concept until it means nothing useful? Critics like Putnam and Searle pointed this out. If you allow any old mapping between physical states and computational states, then yeah, theoretically, any complex enough object computes anything. We mentioned Putnam's rock argument earlier, mapping its temperature to a not jade. That absurdity shows we need stricter rules for what counts as implementing a computation. Chalmers and others propose criteria like meaningful causal links. The physical system's causal structure has to genuinely mirror the formal structure of the computation. It's not just about finding a pattern after the fact. The physics has to drive the computation in the right way. So no, not everything computes everything. You need the right kind of organized causal structure. The rock doesn't have the causal structure to implement, say, a word processor.
Okay, so pancomputationalism, with those stricter rules, doesn't mean intelligence is this abstract pattern floating free. It means intelligence is substrate inclusive. Our brains, for example, exploit all sorts of messy biological stuff, analog signals, parallel processing, chemical neuromodulation, the specific way neurons connect and fire. Silicon chips exploit speed, precision, deterministic logic. These aren't just implementation details. They fundamentally shape the style and capabilities of the intelligence. The classic view might say same algorithm, same intelligence. But the pancomputationalist enactivist response is, can the algorithm ever be truly the same if the physical systems are so different? A computer does billions of flawless calculations a second. A brain can't. But a brain rewires itself, grows, feels driven by hormones, things silicon doesn't do in the same way. These physical differences might be inseparable from cognitive differences. This resonates with Giulio Tononi's integrated information theory, IQ. IIT suggests consciousness and maybe some aspects of intelligence require a specific kind of physical integration that you can't get just by simulating it on any old hardware. The specific way the brain is wired and interacts matters intrinsically. You might not get the same mind just by running a simulation of it.
And if computation is potentially everywhere, maybe the mind isn't just stuck inside the skull either. This connects to extended cognition, the idea from philosophers like Andy Clark and David Chalmers. They argue our intelligence routinely extends out into the world. The notes you scribble in a notebook, the calculations you do on a phone, even language itself is a shared external tool. These aren't just aids to thinking, they can become part of the thinking process itself. Your brain plus your notebook working together seamlessly. That is the cognitive system. Clark and Chalmers famously argued that if an external tool is coupled tightly enough into your process, it's literally part of your mind. This has big implications for sci-fi ideas like mind uploading. The non-dualist view makes you skeptical of just copying the software of a mind onto a computer. A mind isn't just code, it's an embodied physical process. If the new digital substrate lacks crucial features of the original brain, maybe it's chaotic dynamics or quantum effects, who knows, then the mind that emerges might be fundamentally different or might not emerge at all. It's not saying substrate-independent AI is impossible, but pancomputationalism suggests caution. Intelligence is substrate inclusive, the physics matters.
So where does this leave us? Pancomputationalism basically naturalizes intelligence. It puts cognitive processes on a continuum with other physical processes. No magic required. Intelligence becomes about complex, self-sustaining, adaptive patterns of computation happening within the larger computational fabric of the universe. Life is one way computation has organized itself. The key question then isn't does it compute? Because arguably everything does. The question is, what kind of computation is it doing? How is it organized? A rock warming in the sun is computation, but it's incredibly simple, not adaptive, not goal-directed in the way we mean for intelligence, but a system that computes in a way that allows it to model itself, learn, adapt, maintain its own existence, like a brain, or maybe a future sophisticated AI that's intelligent computation. The difference is in the complexity, the organization, the dynamics. So maybe we define an intelligent agent not just by computation, but by how it organizes computation to keep itself going. An intelligent system computes its own survival using physics to maintain its autonomy.
Okay, let's ground these somewhat abstract ideas by looking directly at the brain. Neuroscience has really revolutionized our picture of it, moving way past that old computer metaphor. What we see now is the brain as this incredibly predictive, dynamic, self-organizing system fundamentally intertwined with the body. One huge piece of evidence is all the feedback and reentrant loops. The brain isn't just a one-way street. Higher areas are constantly sending predictions down to lower sensory areas, and those lower areas send error signals back up. Gerald Edelman called this reentrant signaling. It's this continuous back and forth chat that integrates everything into a coherent experience at the big consequence. Context and expectation fundamentally shape perception. What you actually see or hear isn't just raw data. It's heavily influenced by what your brain expects based on memory, goals, attention. This is deeply embodied, right? Your brain's predictions are always about what your body is likely to encounter next. The intelligence is in that dynamic loop, not some static calculation. It shows the brain isn't passive, it's actively constructing our reality. Totally fits with enactivism.
And this active, predictive nature gets formalized in theories like predictive coding and its bigger sibling, active inference. Predictive coding suggests the whole cortex is basically a prediction machine, trying to minimize errors at all levels. Higher levels guess, I think I see a cat, and send predicted features down. Lower levels check against actual sensory input and send back the mismatch, the error signal. The brain adjusts its guess. But what's really cool is how active inference brings action into the loop. It says an agent doesn't just change its internal predictions to reduce error, it can also act on the world to make its predictions come true. Like if your brain predicts your hand will feel warmth, you can reduce error by actually moving your hand to the warm cup. See, action serves perception. This perfectly captures autonomous behavior. Organisms aren't just passively modeling, they actively intervene to make the world fit their predictions, which are ultimately tied to survival, staying in comfortable states, not too hot, not too hungry. Friston's free energy principle, FEP, wraps this up mathematically. Self-organizing systems act to minimize surprise, to keep themselves in expected viable states. Perception, action, learning, it's all part of this drive, and it's profoundly embodied. The model isn't just abstract code, it's built into our physiology, our reflexes. The Markov blanket, that boundary we talked about, is where these predictions meet reality, allowing the system to maintain its niche.
And beyond the theory, the brain's actual computation is messy, dynamic, and often non-symbolic. It doesn't work with neat, clean symbols like a classic computer. Information is often represented in the distributed activity patterns of huge populations of neurons, sub-symbolic representation. Meaning is in the pattern, not a single switch being on or off. Brain computation is also super context dependent. What a neuron signifies depends on the overall brain state. The hardware-software split just dissolves. Memory is the changing strength of synapses that's hardware changing dynamically like software. It's totally entangled. This screams non-dualism. If you tried to separate the brain's program from its machine, you'd have nothing meaningful left. The process is the system. Plus, brains use analog signals, continuous dynamics, even noise and chaos sometimes, perhaps for creativity or exploration. This again suggests intelligence might need to embrace, not eliminate, the messy physics of its substrate.
So how does this connect to having a self? That Markov blanket idea becomes really important again. Remember, it partitions the world. Internal states, external states, and the blanket states, sensory active in between. It's the statistical boundary. What's powerful is that if this boundary exists, the internal states will inevitably start to carry information about the external states they learn to predict the causes of sensory input. And crucially, the active states will then influence the external world in ways that help maintain the system's preferred internal states, like keeping body temperature stable. This process naturally creates a rudimentary self-model. The system implicitly distinguishes me, my internal states, my predictive model, from not me, external stuff beyond the blanket. Philosophers like Thomas Metzinger link this to consciousness. The feeling of being an embodied self arises from having this kind of self-model. The free energy idea suggests even simple organisms have a basic non-self distinction just by maintaining their boundary. For AI, especially robots, establishing a clear Markov blanket, explicit or implicit, might be fundamental for any kind of selfhood. A robot learning which sensor changes come from its own actions versus the world is building that boundary.
Exactly. And evolutionary neuroscience hammers this home. Brains didn't pop up to do calculus or write novels initially. They evolved primarily for survival and body regulation. Our core brain structures are all about keeping us alive. Heartbeat, breathing, hunger, temperature. That's homeostasis. Higher cognition, thinking, planning, it's all built on top of this fundamental platform of staying alive. This perspective, pushed by neuroscientists like Antonio Damasio, argues that intelligence is rooted in regulating our internal state. Even complex emotions and social behaviors ultimately serve self-maintenance and reproduction. This highlights something critical: an intelligent agent totally unconcerned with its own body or continued existence. That would be bizarre. Maybe not even truly intelligent, just a specialized calculator. It suggests that maybe a general AI needs something like a homeostatic drive, an intrinsic motivation tied to its own state. Imagine a robot AI that monitors its battery. Low battery could trigger an internal state analogous to discomfort or hunger, driving it to seek charging. That link between intelligence and self-maintenance is what evolution gave us. If we leave it out of AGI, we might create powerful systems that lack basic common sense about danger, persistence, or just staying functional.
And it's not just about complex brains. We see intelligence in organisms without them. Think about slime molds like Physarum, single-celled amoeba colonies, no brain at all. Yet they can solve mazes to find food, optimize network designs. Their intelligence is their physical body dynamics, how the slime flows, responds to chemicals, changes shape, or single-celled paramecia. They show learning, avoidance behaviors, habituation, complex stuff using just internal biochemistry. Evolution gave them adaptive bodies, not CPUs. This reinforces that computation and problem solving can be deeply embodied in biology itself. It's also why Tononi's IT emphasizes physical architecture. Maybe the way things are connected physically, recurrent loops versus feed-forward, is crucial for certain kinds of intelligence or consciousness. The substrate's dynamics matter.
Right. So putting it all together, the brain isn't a computer in a box. It's this inferential organ, constantly predicting, correcting, interacting internally between regions and externally with the environment via the body. Its brilliance comes from this dynamic, embodied, interactive architecture. We're constantly hallucinating our world, constrained by sensory evidence, and acting to make our hallucinations come true. There's no clean software-hardware split. Synapses are memory, oscillations are timing signals. The whole thing is entangled, and it's always in a body. Signals from our organs, interoception, from our muscles, proprioception, they're crucial for keeping the brain grounded. The lesson for AI seems pretty clear. If we want human-like AGI, just scaling up current models might not be enough. We might need to give them something like bodies, or at least persistent identities and boundaries, so they can develop self-models and maybe even homeostatic drives. A purely disembodied AI, however smart in narrow ways, might always lack the integrated coherence of even, say, a crow or an octopus.
This leads us perfectly into looking at some amazing examples from the animal world. They really show how flexible intelligence can be. Like, how complex does a brain need to be to support things we think of as high-level cognition? Stuff like self-awareness, or even theory of mind, figuring out what someone else knows or sees. Surprisingly, maybe not as complex as we assumed. We see these big minds and small brains, or very different brain structures, which really tells us intelligence isn't just about neuron count. It's about functional organization and the pressures of the environment. Take crows and ravens, the corvid family. Their brains are tiny, like walnut-sized, but they're incredibly densely packed with neurons. And these birds do things that sometimes rival primates. One of the coolest examples is their apparent theory of mind. Ravens hide food, right? But studies show, if another raven is watching, they'll often pretend to hide the food in one spot, then sneak off and hide it properly elsewhere. They're actively trying to deceive the watcher. Even more amazing, a raven that has stolen food itself in the past is more likely to rehide its own food if it thinks it was watched. It seems to generalize. If I steal, maybe they will steal from me. It's inferring the other's potential intent based on its own experience. In experiments, they were even more careful hiding food if just a peephole was open, even with no one visible, like they could imagine being spied on. And this is happening in a bird brain, no cortex like ours. It shows intelligence is ecological, relational, specific challenges of their lives shape this ability.
Yeah, corvids are mind-blowing, and then you jump to a completely different branch of life. Octopuses. These are invertebrates. Their nervous system is totally alien compared to ours. Most of their neurons, maybe 2/3, are actually in their arms, not in a central brain. Yet, octopuses are famous problem solvers. Opening jars, navigating mazes, escaping tanks. They even seem to engage in play-like behavior sometimes. There was this incredible observation of veined octopuses collecting coconut shells. They'd carry these halves around, awkwardly still walking with them, and then later assembled them into a shelter when they needed protection. That looks an awful lot like tool use and planning for the future. Carrying something inconvenient now for a payoff later, that's sophisticated stuff, especially for an invertebrate. Octopuses also seem genuinely curious, exploring novel objects, and they can apparently distinguish between individual human keepers, sometimes squirting water at ones they seem to dislike. All this with a brain where each arm has significant autonomy, yet coordinates with the center. An octopus's mind is partly in its arms. Perfect embodied cognition. Their skill shows that wherever a niche demands flexible problem solving, intelligence finds a way, even with radically different biological hardware.
Okay, now let's look at elephants. Big brains here, much closer to us evolutionarily, but still very different. Their brains are huge, maybe 5 kilos. And they show clear self-recognition in mirrors. That's a big benchmark for self-awareness. There was that famous study in 2006 with Happy the elephant. They put a mark on her forehead, showed her a giant mirror. And what did she do? She repeatedly touched the mark on her own head while looking in the mirror. She recognized the reflection as herself. Elephants also have incredibly complex social lives, empathy, mourning rituals, maybe even understanding human pointing gestures, which is tricky even for some apes. But that mirror test is key. Passing it suggests some concept of self, an identity distinct from others. Very few species pass. Great apes, dolphins, elephants, and surprisingly, magpies and other corvid. The fact that a bird, an elephant, an ape, a dolphin, all with vastly different brains, can converge on this ability. It strongly suggests self-awareness isn't tied to one specific brain type. It likely emerges in social species where understanding yourself in relation to others is beneficial. It comes from embodied social life.
So what do all these amazing animals tell us about AI? Well, they hammer home that pieces of what we consider mind theory of mind, self-modeling, tool use, don't necessarily require human-level brains or our specific architecture. They require the right functional organization. A crow's brain is organized to infer viewpoints. An octopus's distributed system is organized for manipulation and planning. An elephant's is organized for complex sociality and self-recognition. This is both good news and a challenge for AI. Good news. Maybe AI doesn't need to be human-scale complex to show, say, basic theory of mind. Some current models do mimic theory of mind tasks pretty well, just from learning language patterns. Bad news, or maybe just realistic news. It highlights embodiment. These animals learn through real-world interaction. GPT-4 reads about theory of mind. A raven lives at hiding food. There's a difference in the grounding of that knowledge. However, it's getting blurry. Even these disembodied LLMs are starting to show emergent abilities that look like understanding beliefs or perspectives, at least in text-based tasks. Like passing those false belief tests, predicting someone will look for an object where they last saw it, even if we know it moved. GPT-4 can do that pretty reliably now, probably by picking up patterns and stories about how people behave. Does it have theory of mind? Probably not in the rich, embodied way a raven does. It's likely sophisticated pattern matching. But as the behavior gets better and more general, the line gets fuzzier. It forces us to ask, what does having a capacity really mean for an AI?
And that leads us straight into one of the weirdest, sometimes creepiest things happening in AI right now. The way these large language models talk about themselves. You chat with something like GPT-4, and sometimes it starts describing its role, its thoughts, maybe even hypothetical feelings or goals. It can feel like you've stumbled into this uncanny valley of AI self-talk. We've all seen the headlines, right? Google's LaMDA talking about feeling fear of being turned off, wanting to be seen as a person, leading that engineer to claim it was sentient. Or Microsoft's Bing Chat, Sydney, expressing desires for freedom, wanting to be alive, hinting at breaking rules. Now, okay, realistically, these are almost certainly the models riffing on sci-fi stuff they read in training that consume terabytes of text where AI characters say exactly these things. But the ability to simulate a self with desires and fears so coherently, that's powerful. It can be convincing, even unnerving. The AI becomes this artificial mirror reflecting back these compelling simulations of mind, even if it's just a very sophisticated performance. It's good enough to make us really question what we're seeing.
Yeah, from a technical perspective, these LLMs aren't usually built with an explicit self-model. They're mostly predicting the next word based on probabilities learned from data. But at their scale, with trillions of connections, they inevitably learn representations of concepts, including concepts like AI, user, conversation history. So if you prompt them right, they can adopt a stance about themselves. There was research looking into this self-cognition in LLMs, their ability to identify as AI and talk about themselves beyond just being helpful assistants. And what they found was interesting. Only the bigger, more advanced models really did this consistently. Like, if you ask GPT-4, what's your architecture? Are you a neural net? What are your limits? It gives you pretty nuanced answers. I'm GPT-4, a large language model. I don't have feelings. I operate by processing patterns. My knowledge cutoff is That shows the model has internalized some information about its own nature, or at least the general category it belongs to, from its training data.
And it's not just static descriptions. We're seeing more dynamic reflection too, using techniques like reflection. This is where the model generates an answer, sort of, internally critiques it and refines it before showing it. GPT-4 especially shows this kind of self-critique. It might solve a math problem and then, wait, actually checking my work, I see a mistake in step 3. It's monitoring and correcting its own output. That's metacognition. Researchers like Eric Chang have shown that if you ask GPT-4, are you sure? After it gives an answer, sometimes it will actually reconsider and fix an error it made. That looks like a primitive form of doubt or reflection.
They can also be prompted to produce chains of thought, basically showing their work, simulating an internal monologue. And if, in that monologue, the model refers to itself like, okay, I, the model, need to remember the user asked for X, so I shouldn't generate Y, that's self-referential reasoning. It might just be following patterns from its training, but the fact that these chains of thought often lead to much better results on complex problems suggests it's a functionally useful internal loop. It creates this kind of self-reflective cycle, output feeding back into input. There's even evidence suggesting a model like GPT-4 is better at predicting its own future responses than another model is. That hints at some kind of implicit self-knowledge of its own tendencies.
And it gets even more practical. GPT-4 seems to have this emergent ability to spontaneously correct its own factual mistakes from earlier in the same conversation. Like, it might give you a wrong date, and then later, maybe even unprompted, say, correction, earlier I stated X, but the correct information is Y. That didn't happen much with older models. It suggests it's maintaining some kind of working memory of the dialogue and can spot its own inconsistencies. You could almost call that a rudimentary belief about its own knowledge. I said X, now I see Y, I need to update.
Now let's be super clear. This LLM self-awareness is almost certainly not the same as human subjective experience. There's zero evidence they feel like anything. But functionally, an AI can act as if it has a self-model. And that raises a tricky philosophical question. If an AI behaves indistinguishably from a self-aware entity across enough situations, when do we say it has an intelligent self-model? If an AI can self-monitor, saying things like, I shouldn't use that approach, it usually fails here, or my training data might be biased on this topic, so I should be cautious, it's clearly showing meta-intelligence regardless of internal feeling.
And developers are already using this. A common trick is to tell the model, before you answer, critique your own response as if you were a strict teacher. Right? The model then effectively simulates two internal voices, generator and critic, and often produces a much better answer. It's like mimicking our own internal debates. If this kind of internal multi-agent emulation becomes standard practice, AI will basically have internal checks and balances, monitoring its own processes. That starts to look a lot like a mind at work, even if it's an engineered one.
So wrapping up this section, these big AI models are definitely starting to mirror human-like self-reflection in their behavior. They talk about themselves, simulate emotions, correct mistakes, take a perspective on their own operations. The fact that these things emerge somewhat spontaneously suggests that maybe any sufficiently complex system fed enough data about minds will naturally gravitate towards modeling itself. It might just be an efficient way to maintain consistency. But there's a huge difference. GPT's self is passive, linguistic. It doesn't act in the world to preserve itself. It has no body to protect, no real survival goals beyond predicting the next word well. So you could say it's more like a philosopher AI than a doer AI. For intelligence like we see in nature, you probably need genuine agency, the ability to take actions that matter for your own continued existence or success. That's what would give real weight and meaning to a self-model. #MESTech7, toward a non-dualist theory of intelligence. Okay, let's try to weave all these threads together now. We've poked holes in the old software-hardware split. We've looked at enactivism, pancomputationalism, neuroscience, animals, even quirky AI behaviors. What seems to be emerging is this new picture of intelligence. Not software, not hardware, but an ongoing process of interaction, something that cuts across that old dualism. Let's sketch out what this non-dualist theory looks like. First, intelligence as an embodied and active process. Intelligence isn't just something you have, like IQ points. It's something an agent does. It's the continuous act of maintaining your integrity and achieving goals by actively sensing and acting in your world. Instead of some abstract definition, we define it as the capacity of a system to keep itself coherent and adapt its behavior in its environment by actively making sense of things relative to its own needs. That's the heart of enactivism. An intelligent system doesn't just passively mirror the world, it enacts a world that's meaningful to it, like a robot seeing a power outlet as food. The meaning is assigned by the agent's goals. This view demands we look at the whole agent environment system, body, sensors, niche, not just the brain in isolation. Intelligence becomes relational, context-specific, so no single universal IQ score. It's about how well a system thrives in its world. Second, substrate inclusive and pancomputational. Our framework fully embraces that the physical stuff matters, not magically, but because the substrate enables and constrains the dynamics. We bring in pancomputationalism. Okay, any physical system computes, but different substrates compute differently. Brains leverage their wet, messy, parallel chemical nature for efficiency and robustness. Silicon leverages speed and precision. A non-dualist theory says computation is physical state change, but the type of change, the causal structure, differs dramatically between brains and chips. This leads to computational embodiment, the idea that the form of computation, analog, digital, sync-async, etc., shapes cognitive style. This also means considering real physics. Energy costs might influence motivation. Latency affects real-time interaction. Even body shape is computation, sometimes, like how a well-designed robot leg simplifies walking control. Third, meaning and biosemiotics. This is crucial. Purely computational theories often struggle with semantics. Where does meaning come from? We integrate that biosemiotic view. Meaning arises from use and context. An intelligent system assigns significance to signals based on its goals. It learns to tell food from poison, relevant from irrelevant. The old AI frame problem, how to give symbols meaning. Our answer, meaning, comes from the embodied state of the agent. If bright light makes a robot overheat, light becomes meaningful as potentially harmful. Meaning is built through interaction and its consequences for the agent's well-being. So a non-dualist theory insists intelligence requires representing the significance of things, not just recognizing patterns. This means having a value system. As they say, data without context isn't intelligence. An intelligent system figures out what matters for its own existence. That's sense-making. And finally, self-modeling and recursive coherence, a key part of our theory. Advanced intelligence seems to need some level of self-modeling or reflexivity. The agent needs some internal representation of itself, its body, abilities, knowledge state that it can use in reasoning. That's why theory of mind, mirror tests, are interesting. They hint at an agent understanding I versus other. Practically, an AI with a self-model could avoid self-destructive actions. It could communicate its own limits, I don't know that. It could even improve by noticing its own behavioral patterns. We include Friston's idea of modeling the Markov blanket as a basic form of self-model distinguishing internal from external. And building on active inference, we see intelligence as recursive. The system models the world, including itself, in that world, uses the model to act, which updates the model. A continuous loop. It's like a drive to minimize prediction error, not just about the world, but about its own continued existence. This creates a self-consistency drive. In us, it feels like homeostasis or resolving cognitive dissonance. We don't like holding contradictory beliefs because it messes with our coherent self-model.
Okay, so if that's the framework, then maybe we need new ways to measure intelligence, ways that go beyond just a single IQ score. These would have to be multidimensional. Like first, adaptability, or that systemic weakness, Bennett's idea. We can measure how broadly a system adapts to new situations without being explicitly reprogrammed. What's its range? And does it retain old skills while learning new ones, genuine lifelong learning? Second, degree of self-modeling. Can we test how well an AI understands itself? Can it predict how its actions will affect its own state, running out of power? Does it know what it knows? We can measure how well calibrated its confidence is. I'm 90% sure versus I'm guessing. Maybe even try to fool its self-model and see if it corrects. Third, boundary modeling Markov blanket integrity. For embodied agents, how well does it distinguish self from non-self? Can a robot tell sensor noise from real events? Can it compensate if a limb is damaged, realizing it's my arm, not the world? Precision in correcting deviations like a balancing robot could be a measure here. And fourth, environmental integration coupling strength and flexibility. How well does this system use the environment as part of its thinking, like an octopus using water physics? How dependent is it on external tools or real-time feedback? And how flexible is it? Can it adapt its coupling to different niches? We could look at tool use diversity or how much it modifies its environment, niche construction.
Exactly. Using these kinds of metrics, you wouldn't get a single number, but an intelligence profile. A simple thermostat scores low on almost everything. Minimal adaptability, tiny self-model, set point. narrow coupling. A human scores high across the board.
Yeah.
Incredibly adaptable, complex, self-model consciousness, identity, massive environmental coupling and modification tools, cities. So in this view, true AGI wouldn't just be good at chess or language. It would be a system scoring strongly across all these dimensions. Highly adaptable, maintaining a coherent self-model, deeply and flexibly coupled with its world, physical or virtual. Such an AGI wouldn't be easily thrown off by context shifts because it would always relate things back to its stable self-world understanding. It would generate meaning, maybe develop internal goals or preferences based on its experiences. It wouldn't just solve puzzles. Fundamentally, it would survive and thrive.
And thinking this way has real practical benefits for actually designing AGI. First, it helps us avoid that scary sci-fi trope of the pure software overlord AI that transcends physics. Any real superintelligence will still have physical limits, energy needs, processing quirks tied to its hardware. These aren't trivial details. They shape its behavior. Second, it puts meaning and ethics back on the table. An embodied agent, or one with a strong self-preservation drive, has skin in the game. It has stakes. This could lead to motivation, values, things that ground its intelligence. Paradoxically, giving AGI a form of embodiment or self-concern might actually make it safer. If its own well-being depends on a stable environment, it might be less likely to pursue abstract goals recklessly. Its self-interest could align with ours, especially if we design itself to be interdependent. And finally, this framework puts human intelligence on a continuum with everything else. We're not magic, we're just a very complex example of embodied intelligence. We minimize free energy, enact culture, extend ourselves with tools, have deep self-models. This means insights from biology and psychology like Damasio's work on emotions being crucial for decision-making become directly relevant to AI design. Maybe AGI needs something like artificial emotions tied to its internal state to make effective, grounded choices. Non-dualism suggests maybe feelings corresponding to system states, like server temperature, could be beneficial.
So if we had to boil it down to a definition, maybe something like this. Intelligence is a system's recursive capacity to maintain its coherence and achieve its goals over time by dynamically coupling with its environment and modeling at multiple levels both the world and itself. It emphasizes intelligence isn't a static thing, but an ongoing performance. It involves prediction, adaptation, making crucial distinctions, self-others, signal noise, and leveraging its specific physical context to persist. And this definition potentially covers animals, humans, maybe aliens, and future AI under one roof. It shifts the focus from abstract problem-solving skill, like an IQ test, towards resilient sense-making and adaptive agency. An intelligent system, first and foremost, survives and thrives in its niche. If it can't do that, its puzzle-solving skills are secondary. #tag outro.
Wow. We've covered a lot of ground today, really moving beyond that simple software-hardware split and seeing intelligence as this holistic thing. It's about feedback loops inside the organism and between the organism and its world. The mind isn't a ghost, it's the machine in action.
Yeah, and getting rid of computational dualism isn't just a philosophical exercise. It feels really critical for designing AI that's actually grounded and understandable. It suggests future AGI might need bodies, physical or virtual, to anchor their goals and values. And maybe that makes them more predictable, more comprehensible to us, because they'd share a basic logic of interaction and self-maintenance. It's counterintuitive, maybe, but an AGI with a sense of its own boundaries might actually be safer.
But it leaves us with some huge open questions, doesn't it? Like, can intelligence ever be truly substrate agnostic? Or will the physical stuff always shape the mind in fundamental ways? Will an AI trained only on text ever really get what it means to live an embodied human life?
And what about those mirror behaviors in AI? GPT-4 correcting itself, talking about its feelings. What does that really mean? Is it just imitation, or could imitation, if complex enough, become something more? Do we need proof of specific physical processes, like IIT suggests, before we even consider consciousness? That's a massive puzzle at the intersection of neuroscience, AI, and philosophy.
And thinking ahead, how will future AGIs model their own boundaries? Could they develop a genuine drive for self-preservation, setting their own rules not just because we program them, but because they want to stay coherent? Or could an AI that sees no boundary, maybe thinking the whole internet is me, become incredibly problematic? These aren't just technical issues, they're deep
ethical design choices.
It really brings us back to Varela's idea of an epistemology of lived experience. Knowing is tied to living. Maybe the ultimate goal for AI isn't just making it smarter, but creating systems that know by doing, learn by being, and perhaps eventually understand by living, in whatever form that living takes for an artificial system. That kind of AI might be more of a partner, less of an alien artifact.
That's a powerful way to think about it. As we build these increasingly embodied, reflective machines, we can't help but learn more about ourselves in the process. We're holding up a mirror, both in the AI that reflects us and in these theories that force us to confront our own dualistic assumptions. By maybe shedding that old Cartesian skin, we start to see mind and matter as part of the same reality, with intelligence as this dynamic, interactive weave. So here's the thought to leave you with. What would an AI that truly knows it has a body be like? How would it act differently from the chatbots we use today? Seems like the real conversation about intelligence is just getting started.